The Council of Nicaea is often remembered as one of the holiest moments in Christian history, the place where the truth of God was finally revealed. That's the story told in churches for centuries. A room filled with bishops, guided by the Spirit, hammering out timeless truth. But the reality? It's far less divine and far more political. Behind the stained glass legend lies a raw power struggle. In 325 CE, the Roman Empire was falling apart. Civil wars, invasions, and economic collapse had left it fractured. Constantine had clawed his way to the throne, but he knew one thing: an empire divided doesn't survive. He needed a tool powerful enough to unite millions of people under one banner, and he found it in Christianity. But there was a problem. Christianity itself was a mess. Different sects taught different gospels. Bishops denounced each other, and street riots broke out over theology. There was no one Christianity, and so Constantine did what emperors do: he forced a decision. The Council of Nicaea wasn't a holy debate. It was a political summit dressed in robes and incense. A meeting not about discovering truth, but about manufacturing it. And the creed that billions still recite today? It wasn't born of revelation, it was born of imperial calculation. So, what really happened in that council chamber? And how much of what people call eternal faith is actually the product of Roman politics? Let's find out. Rome in crisis. To understand why the Council of Nicaea even happened, you first have to picture the Roman Empire in the early 4th century. On the surface, it was still massive, stretching from Britain to North Africa, from Spain to the Middle East. But beneath that size lay weakness. Civil wars had ripped the empire apart for decades. Generals murdered rivals, provinces broke loyalty, and barbarian invasions pressed constantly at the borders. By the time Constantine clawed his way to the throne, Rome wasn't the unstoppable giant it had once been. It was an exhausted empire, bleeding money, troops, and trust. Stability was fragile, and Constantine knew his power was not guaranteed. In moments like this, emperors looked for glue, something strong enough to hold millions of people together across languages, cultures, and geography. Traditional Roman religion no longer worked. The old gods of Jupiter and Mars had lost their unifying pull. Pagan rituals felt outdated in an empire craving new identity. Christianity, however, was growing fast. It had followers from Syria to Spain. It had bishops organizing communities, and, most importantly, it offered a single God above all others. That was something Constantine could use. But there was a catch. Christianity wasn't one religion at all. It was dozens of competing movements, each with their own gospels, their own leaders, and their own interpretations of Jesus. Instead of being a unifying force, it was chaos waiting to spill over. For Constantine, that chaos wasn't just theology, it was politics. A divided religion meant a divided empire, and he couldn't afford either. That's why he called the bishops to Nicaea, not to ask, what's true, but to demand, what can keep the empire together? Christianity, a divided movement. When people today think of early Christianity, they imagine one clear faith handed down from Jesus to his apostles, then spreading outward like a single stream. But in reality, it looked more like a wild river delta, dozens of branching channels, all claiming to be the true way. Some groups saw Jesus as a wise human prophet, chosen by God but not divine. Others believed he was a mystical revealer, a cosmic being who only appeared human. Still, others insisted he was equal to God from eternity. To make it even more confusing, different churches read different gospels. Some followed the four we know today: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Others read texts that didn't make it into the Bible: the Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of Peter, or Gospels now lost to history. This diversity wasn't a problem at first. For small, scattered communities, local interpretation worked just fine. But as Christianity grew, it became a threat to Roman order. Rival bishops denounced each other. Street fights erupted between congregations. Sermons weren't just about theology, they were political weapons, stirring anger, riots, even violence. To Constantine, watching from his throne, this wasn't a squabble over words. It was a civil war in the making. A divided Christianity meant a divided empire. And he needed the opposite: a faith that could function as a single banner, one creed, one voice, one identity to unify the empire's millions. But how do you get rival bishops, each certain they hold the truth, to agree? You don't ask politely. You summon them under imperial authority. You feed them, house them, and make sure they know. The emperor expects consensus. That's why Constantine set the stage for Nicaea. The empire didn't need truth, it needed order. Constantine's real motive. Constantine's conversion to Christianity is often painted as a spiritual awakening, a pagan emperor seeing the light of Christ. But when you peel back the layers of legend, the reality looks far more pragmatic. Constantine was first and foremost a politician. He had clawed his way to power through years of bloody civil wars, defeating rival emperors one by one. By the time he emerged as sole ruler, Rome was fractured, exhausted, and bleeding resources. He needed something stronger than swords to hold it together. That something was religion. Constantine saw what generations of emperors before him had known. Faith is one of the most effective tools for ruling people. Pagan Rome had always used religion as glue, requiring citizens to honor the gods of the state alongside their own local deities. But Christianity was different. It was growing fast, it was organized, and it demanded exclusive loyalty. A faith like that could either tear an empire apart or unite it under a single banner. The problem? Christianity itself was splintering. Competing groups argued endlessly about who Jesus really was. Was he created or eternal? Human or divine? Equal to God or subordinate? These weren't just academic debates. They divided cities, set bishops against each other, and threatened to destabilize the empire from within. So Constantine acted, but not as a theologian. He barely understood the fine points of doctrine. He acted as a ruler. He didn't care which side won the argument, only that one side did. Consensus meant stability. A single creed meant unity, and unity meant survival of the empire. That was his real motive. Not salvation, not faith, control. Nicaea was never about divine truth. It was about imperial order. The Arius clash. The Council of Nicaea wasn't called in a vacuum. It was triggered by one of the fiercest theological battles of the ancient world, a dispute that sounds abstract on the surface, but was explosive in practice. At the center of it was Arius, a priest from Alexandria. His teaching was bold, even shocking. Jesus, he argued, was not eternal. He was created by God, exalted above all humans, yes, but still subordinate to the Father. To Arius, there was one supreme God, and Jesus was his son, divine in some sense, but not equal. For his opponents, led by Athanasius, this idea was intolerable. If Jesus was less than God, then salvation itself was in jeopardy. Only an eternal, fully divine Christ could bridge the gap between humanity and heaven. Anything less made the entire Christian message collapse. What began as a theological disagreement soon tore entire communities apart. Bishops denounced each other in sermons. Congregations split down the middle. In Alexandria, riots broke out between factions, with mobs shouting theological slogans in the streets. To us today, debating whether Jesus was created or uncreated might sound like splitting hairs. But in the 4th century, those hairs were the fault lines of empire. Because beneath the theology was identity. The way you defined Jesus determined how you prayed, how you worshipped, and ultimately which side you belonged to. It wasn't just an argument over words. It was a battle over loyalty, power, and truth itself. This was the fire Constantine stepped into, and he realized quickly, if the empire couldn't settle this one question, it might not survive at all. The stage-managed council. When Constantine summoned the bishops to Nicaea in 325, he wasn't inviting them to a free debate. He was staging a performance, one that would signal to the empire that the emperor himself now sat at the crossroads of faith and power. More than 300 bishops traveled from across the Roman world, their expenses paid by the state. They were housed in imperial lodgings, dined at Constantine's banquets, and escorted with honor as if they were dignitaries of state. On the surface, this looked like respect for the church. In reality, it was control. These men were now the emperor's guests, dependent on his hospitality. That dependency carried an unspoken pressure. Don't bite the hand that feeds you. When the council opened, Constantine entered not as a humble believer but as a ruler cloaked in gold and purple, dazzling with jewels. He sat on a throne above the bishops, presiding like a judge over the proceedings. His message was clear. The time for endless debate was over. Disunity was dangerous. The empire needed one creed, one voice, one truth. The bishops argued fiercely, but the shadow of imperial authority hung over every word. To resist consensus wasn't just to resist other churchmen, it was to risk exile. Unity or exile became the unspoken law of the gathering. In the end, the council did not function like a spiritual retreat. It functioned like a courtroom, with Constantine ensuring that a final verdict was reached. The creed that emerged carried the stamp of bishops, yes, but it bore the weight of the emperor most of all. The birth of orthodoxy and heresy. The outcome of Nicaea was not compromise, it was conquest. Arius and his supporters argued that Jesus, though divine in some sense, was not equal to God the Father. That view had stirred cities, ignited riots, and nearly torn Christianity in half. Constantine couldn't allow that division to survive. So under the emperor's watchful eye, a creed was drafted, the statement of belief that would become the cornerstone of Orthodox Christianity. Its key phrase was explosive. Jesus was declared of the same substance as the Father. In just a few words, the council drew a bright red line across Christian thought. On one side stood orthodoxy, the belief that Jesus was eternal, equal, and fully divine. On the other side stood heresy, the view that Christ was subordinate or created. Arius was not just outvoted, he was condemned. His writings were ordered burned. He himself was exiled. And suddenly, a theological opinion had become a political crime. This was the birth of orthodoxy as law. No longer could Christians hold diverse ideas about who Jesus was. The creed defined the boundary, and anything beyond it was branded dangerous. For the first time in Christian history, disagreement was no longer debate, it was heresy. The irony is hard to miss. A religion once persecuted for refusing to conform now created its own machinery of exclusion. Arius became the first in a long line of thinkers silenced by councils. The Creed of Nicaea was less about eternal truth and more about drawing battle lines that served the empire's need for unity. What was once faith became formula, and from that moment, to question the formula was to risk everything. What ordinary Christians never knew. While bishops in Nicaea argued over Greek words like substance and essence, the ordinary Christians of the empire were living in a completely different world. Farmers were battling famine, mothers were trying to keep children alive through disease, and soldiers were marching endless campaigns to defend shaky borders. For them, faith was not about philosophical abstractions. It was about survival, prayer, and finding hope in small rituals that made daily suffering bearable. Most of these people never heard the debates of Arius or Athanasius. They didn't know what homoousios meant, nor did they care. The Jesus they followed was not a puzzle of metaphysics. He was a figure of comfort, a healer, a teacher whose parables spoke to real life. But once the council declared a creed, those ordinary believers were suddenly bound by definitions they had never debated. Their local traditions, their simple stories, even their gospels, all of it was overshadowed by the formula drawn up in an imperial hall far from their homes. The disconnect is staggering. The creed that shaped Christianity for centuries did not emerge from the hearts of believers, but from the political needs of an emperor and the arguments of elites. Yet it became the test of faith for farmers who never set foot in a council chamber, and for soldiers who couldn't read a single line of Greek. What ordinary Christians never knew was that the truth of their faith had been hammered out by politics, not revelation. And from that day forward, they were expected to recite words they didn't choose and obey rules they never agreed to. Suppression of diversity. Before Nicaea, Christianity was anything but uniform. Different communities held different gospels, different traditions, and different visions of who Jesus really was. Some saw him as a prophet, others as a mystical revealer, others as a teacher of wisdom, and still others as a cosmic figure who only appeared human. The richness of belief was messy, but it was alive. The council changed that. By declaring one version, orthodox, everything else became heresy. And once the line was drawn, suppression began. Alternative gospels, like the Gospel of Thomas or the Gospel of Peter, were marginalized, banned, and eventually erased. Teachers who didn't conform were silenced or exiled. Arius himself, whose views had sparked the controversy, was expelled and his writings ordered to be burned. This wasn't about discovering eternal truth, it was about eliminating competition. The empire could not tolerate diversity of belief, because diversity threatened unity. And so the vast spectrum of early Christianity was narrowed into a single formula. The tragedy is how much was lost. Whole libraries of thought were destroyed. Stories that once circulated widely disappeared forever, leaving us only fragments quoted by their enemies. What survived was not necessarily what was most meaningful, but what was most politically useful. From then on, truth in Christianity was whatever the empire allowed to survive. Doctrines were preserved by decree, not by the natural consensus of believers. Heresy became not just error, but a crime. And with each act of suppression, the Church moved further away from its grassroots beginnings and deeper into the machinery of imperial control. This was the real legacy of Nicaea, not clarity, but censorship, not revelation, but rewriting. The empire defined the faith by force and erased the voices that once made it diverse. Constantine the pragmatist. If the Council of Nicaea was supposed to be about divine revelation, the man behind it makes the story far less holy. Constantine, the emperor who convened the council, was not a devout Christian saint. He was a political strategist, and a shrewd one. Even after presiding over the council that declared Jesus equal to God, Constantine kept his old titles. He remained Pontifex Maximus, the chief priest of Rome's traditional religion. He continued minting coins bearing the image of Sol Invictus, the unconquered sun god. He still performed pagan rituals, still honored Rome's pantheon, and delayed his own baptism until his deathbed. This wasn't hypocrisy so much as calculation. Constantine understood that religion was power, and power meant survival. He didn't want to alienate Rome's pagan majority, so he kept one foot in their world. At the same time, he saw Christianity's potential to unify his fractured empire, so he gave it imperial backing. To Constantine, faith was not about salvation, it was about stability. That duality tells us something crucial. The emperor who helped define Christian doctrine wasn't interested in metaphysical truth. He was interested in political theater. He needed symbols of unity, loyalty, and control, and the Church gave them to him. This is why the Council of Nicaea cannot be separated from politics. Constantine didn't care which side of the theological fight was right. He cared about ending division. Declaring one side orthodox and the other heretical was a tool, a way to consolidate authority. The irony is stark. The man most responsible for shaping Christianity's core beliefs may never have believed them as Christians today imagine. His use of religion was instrumental, not devotional, and that pragmatism left a legacy still echoing in churches today. The dangerous legacy. What began at Nicaea didn't end there. In many ways, it was only the beginning. Once Constantine set the precedent that theology could be settled by council and enforced by imperial decree, the rules of the game changed forever. From that point on, to disagree with doctrine wasn't just a spiritual difference. It became a political crime. Heresy was born, and once heresy existed as a category, it could never be removed. Every dispute that followed, about the Trinity, the Holy Spirit, the Virgin Mary, even icons, was handled the same way: call a council, declare one side orthodox, and condemn the other. The consequences were profound. Faith stopped being about moral teaching or lived experience. It became about obedience to formulas crafted in council chambers. Ordinary Christians were expected to recite words they didn't understand. Of the same substance, eternal, begotten not made, as proof of loyalty. Correct belief mattered more than compassion, charity, or justice. Councils became power plays. Bishops jockeyed for influence. Emperors used them to test loyalty. Truth was decided not by revelation, but by majority vote under imperial pressure. And once a creed was signed, those who resisted faced exile, disgrace, or worse. This legacy reshaped Christianity. The persecuted faith of martyrs evolved into the persecuting faith of empire. Dissenting voices were silenced, alternative texts destroyed, diversity erased. The same empire that once tried to stamp out Christianity now used Christianity to stamp out its own internal enemies. The dangerous precedent of Nicaea was this: unity mattered more than truth. Once that principle was accepted, faith became a tool of control, and councils became the empire's way of deciding what billions would later call eternal truth. The scam that stuck. The Council of Nicaea is often painted as a holy gathering, bishops divinely guided to declare eternal truth. But peel back the legend, and what you find looks very different. The creed that billions still repeat wasn't delivered by revelation, it was manufactured under imperial pressure. Constantine needed unity more than theology. He needed his empire glued together after years of civil war. And so, the bishops weren't free thinkers in search of truth, they were guests of the emperor, dining at his banquets, debating under his watchful eye. The message was clear: fall in line or risk exile. That's how orthodoxy was born, not through spiritual enlightenment, but through politics. The words of the same substance became the dividing line, not because they carried timeless wisdom, but because they satisfied the emperor's demand for consensus. Heresy became a crime, loyalty became doctrine, and faith became obedience. The irony is hard to miss. A religion once persecuted for resisting empire was reshaped to serve empire. The persecuted became persecutors, and the creed became a political tool disguised as divine truth. And yet, it stuck. To this day, Christians across the world recite the Nicene Creed as if it came straight from heaven. In reality, it came from a council chamber, a carefully managed compromise, crafted under the shadow of imperial power. The real lesson of Nicaea is this: what people call eternal truth often carries the fingerprints of human ambition, political need, and the raw pursuit of control. If you value digging into history's hidden truths, subscribe now, and don't let the official story be the only story you know.